I'll do it. Let's go to Isaiah 7:14. I alluded to this last week. I want to go into it a little deeper. I want you to get this idea of how do we interpret prophecy? How do we understand the prophets? And you have to look at these signs as signifying something beyond what they are. Okay? Isaiah 7:14. This is a very famous verse. We just had Christmas. It should be familiar to everybody.
Isaiah
7:14, but we're going to actually start at verse 10. And the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ahaz is the king of Israel. And he says, ask for a sign of the Lord your God, and let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Now you have to know something about Ahaz. He was not some righteous king. He was a wicked king. God comes to him and says, ask me for a sign. Be as big as you want. High as heaven or as low as the grave. Ask for a sign. And Ahaz says, oh, no, Lord, I won't do something like that. I won't put you to the test. Please, you've been putting him to the test your whole reign with your wickedness. Get it? God's not impressed with your impiety. He sees through it. And he said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, that's my translation. If you have my Bible, you'll notice there's a little footnote. And if you drop down to the footnote, it says young woman. That's the actual Hebrew word in this passage. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. Where do we get, well, how come it's translated virgin then? Because in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, remember that? The Greek translation of the Old Testament, when they translated the word Alma from Hebrew, they used the word Parthenos, which means virgin. This is what is quoted in Matthew's Gospel when he said, thus fulfills what was spoken by the prophet, behold, a virgin shall conceive. So we know when Matthew wrote his Gospel, he was looking at the Greek Old Testament because he takes the same word. Now, what am I getting at with this? Understanding how Matthew understands this verse as the fulfillment in Jesus is kind of like reading a murder mystery and going to the last page, and find out from Hercule Poirot who did it. I know who did it now, right? How many of you get a murder mystery and read the last pages? Why? Why don't you do that?
It's not interesting.
It's not interesting anymore. I know who did it. I'm reading it. I know who did it. I know who did it. He looks the same, but he's not doing it. Right? In the same way, when you say, who is the prophet speaking of in this verse? And your first reaction is to say, Jesus. Right? You would actually be incorrect. What do you mean? Now, you just said, Matthew quotes it and says that this is fulfilled. Yes, that is an element of it. But what did it mean to Ahaz when Isaiah prophesied this to him? He was going to say, oh, you mean Mary is going to give birth to Jesus in Bethlehem 700 years from now? Oh, okay. That's the sign. We should wait. No. Again, we miss the message if we jump to the end and just say, oh, it's Jesus. There is certainly that element to it. Obviously there is. But when we read Isaiah and we read this part, what did it mean for them then?
Impossible is possible.
That's part of it. Think about the scene. Ahab, the wicked king, Isaiah comes, he's the prophet. God says what to him first? Ask for a sign. What does Ahaz reply? I'm not going to ask for a sign. I'm not going to tempt the Lord. And then what happens? God gives a sign anyway. Now the question is, would Ahaz have recognized it? Yes. God fulfilled this in Ahaz's time. A young woman conceived and bore a son and named him Emmanuel. Meaning, what was the point? The point is that God is going to fulfill all that he's saying to you, Ahaz, and here's the sign that you didn't ask for, but you're going to get anyway. And a young woman conceived and bore a son. Tradition has it that this happened to the queen mother. In Jewish tradition, this happened to the queen mother. She bore a child miraculously. And that's how Ahaz recognized it was God's fulfillment. In other words, it had a fulfillment and an understanding for them then. Did it have a future fulfillment? Yes. A greater fulfillment? Yes. And what is that greater fulfillment? Jesus. Jesus. Because he then becomes the sign to a wayward Israel who is not obeying the Lord, and the sign is given to them even when they're not asking for it. Did Jesus come when they were wanting him to come?
Yes.
Was anyone expecting him?
No.
Did anyone even know he was born? No, it took angels to get shepherds to come. It took a star to get wise men. Did anyone else come?
No.
Why not? They didn't know. They weren't waiting or asking. You see, the situation in Israel is not unlike what happened with Ahaz. So what happened in Ahaz's time in a microcosm later becomes a macrocosm in the life of Jesus. Am I making sense here? Do you see what I'm talking about? Why am I going over all of this? Because when we start reading through the book of Revelation, and we start seeing things like the rivers turn to blood, we start seeing hailstones, we start seeing the dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and we wonder, what the flip does all of this mean? We can't just start there. We have to see what the background of it is. What would the people who have read this first in the first century have thought of when they saw this? And the only way they would have had any reference was what? The Old Testament. So to understand the book of Revelation, I made this illustration before, I'll make it again. Here's the book of Revelation in my Bible. To understand this much of the Bible, you have to understand this much of the Bible. Yes?
Yes.
And the problem nowadays with people picking up the Bible and starting their own churches and all this, and invariably they start preaching on the end times and the end of the world, and Obama's the Antichrist, Trump's the Antichrist, this and this is the Antichrist, and they're trying to read this without ever understanding this. Because if they did, they would stop doing things like that because they only make themselves look like fools. Why? Because you can't just do things things like that. You do harm to the scripture. You're not understanding it, you're not reading it in the way it was meant to be understood. And this is why Revelation is so confounding and so confusing. Because you're trying to understand this much of the Bible because it's so fantastic and so exciting without having ever tried this.